Morning, Trinity. I'm doing good, thanks. I'm just prepping for a big conference call later.
My mother, Deborah K. Johnson, started her career in the correctional facility around 1981. She was out of college from Tennessee State University and had a degree in criminal justice. She started off at the bottom as a correctional officer. She loved what she did, and she climbed that ladder like Pac-Man, just kept eating up the steps. Over a course of 36 years, not only has she been the first black female deputy warden, been the first black female warden, she had climbed to where she was a correctional administrator, which allowed her to oversee the wardens of the prisons in Tennessee.
Okay, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
I understand why Mom was so strict on us and why she was so disciplined, because she went to work every day and saw exactly how she did not want her kids to turn out.
It's a regular Wednesday, August 7th, 2019, but there's no sign of Deborah at work.
Sometime around 10:30 in the morning, the folks that she worked with were concerned because not only had she not physically appeared for work, but they hadn't heard from her on the phone. Something seemed very, very wrong.
The guard went to check on Deborah.
The house was on the prison grounds, but not in the confinements of the prison. So she was right outside of the fence.
She saw Deborah's car in the driveway. She knocked on the front door, did not get a response.
Deborah? Deborah, are you here? Hello?
She went in and saw Deborah was laying on the bed and she was non-responsive. Then they call for outside law enforcement.
The alarm goes off, all prisoners are locked down, there's no more movement within the prison.
Over 2,000 prisoners are confined to their cells, and a full head count is underway.
I arrived on the scene a little after 1:20 p.m. One of the highest-ranking members of the Tennessee Department of Correction was declared deceased at a home on the prison grounds. I've noticed several law enforcement vehicles, several personnel in front of the house, also inside the house. I immediately requested everyone remove themselves from the home. It is now a crime scene. I walked inside the home. I saw a deceased female subject.
She's face up. Her shirt has been pulled up, and she's nude from the waist down.
She had ligature marks on her neck. I discovered a telephone cord next to her on a bed, which we believe was used to strangle her.
Everybody was just in disbelief that, someone of that standing had been brutally attacked, raped, and murdered.
It's hard for me to get the words out, so all I can just say is my mom died. That's all I can get out because I'm crying. I'm trying to explain. That's all I have for them.
Raised to my grandmother's house is kind of like the headquarters for the family. First person I was looking for was my sister. When we saw each other, we just hugged and we cried and we hugged and we cried. And it seemed like forever before we let each other go.
And our minds are playing through our heads like, oh my God, did she take her blood pressure medicine? We're playing all of the scenarios because we're thinking natural causes, right?
It was one of the worst days of my life, if not the worst day. I was in shock.
We want to know everything we can know about Deborah Johnson.
Hey, what can you tell me about the victim?
We interviewed the guard. Does she have any enemies? Has she had any problems with any inmates? Have any inmates threatened her? Just so many things you want to ask them to try to get to the bottom of it.
Deborah was 64 years old and just a very kind, well-respected person. She was known for her kindness to inmates.
They called her Queen. Hey, Queen. The Queen is on the yard. Queen is here. Queen, you know, so she really, really enjoyed that. She treated them almost like they were her kids. Like the way that she parented us is how she parented them. It even got to the point she would volunteer me for things. I'm like, Mom, you have to really stop volunteering me. Like, I don't like doing stuff like that. Quit volunteering me.
She never thought they were bad people. No matter what they did, they could be murderers, con artists, rapists, whatever. She didn't look at them as damaged. She just looked at them as injured who could be nursed back to health.
Agent Baker continues to scour Deborah's house for evidence.
I look around the room. And then you see an inmate vest in there. You're like, well, why would this lady have an inmate vest in here?
Obviously, an inmate has been in the house.
Anytime we have a violent crime, we do a canvass in the area and attempt to discover video cameras, because video can really tell us the story. In a perfect world, you're going to have a camera right on the house, but unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. That doesn't happen. At a prison, your cameras are going to be focused on, say, perimeter areas. They were designed to focus on prisoner control. There was not really any camera footage of the house, per se, where the camera's showing the roads and stuff like that around that area. Yes. What do they show? We need copies of them immediately.
Every inmate on that compound was a suspect because they're inmates. On this compound, you have a maximum security area where male inmates are housed, and they are strictly behind the barbed wire fence. Inmates go through classifications as they serve their time. They either apply for or they're given an opportunity to obtain minimum trustee status.
They are on the minimum security wing. They're released to work during the day. There are no gates. This is a 6,000-acre working farm. It's normal to see inmates all day long, all over this property, moving freely.
Normally, they are not to go into a private residence without a guard escort.
The house that Deborah Johnson was in is not too far from the farm shop in the area where inmates who were granted trustee status were allowed to leave the confines of the prison.
We know that the victim was alive around 8:10 a.m., it would make sense for him to be in that area around that time. We located a vest inside the house. We were looking for this suspect without a vest on. We were reviewing footage on the main road that goes into the prison.
Rewind.
As we were reviewing the video, you see a golf cart come into focus. We know it's an inmate based on the clothing they're wearing. Well, it's not uncommon to see the prisoners driving these.
Play it again.
All inmates who are assigned to work outside,
Freeze it.
they are required to wear some sort of safety vest.
Zoom in.
The one thing you cannot see is that fluorescent vest. We have a prisoner vest inside the home of a homicide victim, and this person is driving away from that house in a cart without a vest on somewhere between 8:30 and 9. So that's huge for us because we know she was alive at 8:10, and he's seen in this area between 8:30 and 9. So I'm thinking, it's probably gonna be our guy.
You know that guy?
We learn that the inmate's name is Curtis Watson. This person was a trustee, but he was a violent person. Mr. Watson has been incarcerated for quite some time for aggravated kidnapping, aggravated assault, very serious violent crimes. He had a few more years until he completed his sentence. And we're like, all right, we've got our guy. What does he do next?
Zoom in. He's talking to a prison guard.
You see them stop and have some sort of interaction. Then you see the vehicles proceed on the same direction they had originally been on in the first place. We looked at all the available footage on the prison grounds of cars coming and going, and unfortunately, we just never saw him anymore. We can identify that guard he had the interactions with.
I'm gonna need to speak with him.
We can talk to that person and hopefully find out more.
The prison head count is now complete. It confirms Curtis Watson is missing.
We know he's got a prior violent felony conviction. We know he's been in Deborah Johnson's house. We know she's been murdered.
That's our guy.
Where is Curtis Watson?
Special Agent Baker interviews the prison guard seen on CCTV.
The prison guard that stopped him just gave a statement saying, hey, he noticed the prisoner without a vest on. He also asked him what he was doing at the time, where he was going. He said, hey, I had to fix something over at this house, and then I was moving along. That's what he's known for, so it really didn't raise any red flags. He tried to correct his behavior. This is what you need to do. You need to get another vest. You need to go on your assignment, and that's it.
Detective Baker heads to the mechanic shop to find out where Watson went next.
Good afternoon. Agent Chuck Baker. Need to ask you some questions about Curtis Watson's movements this morning.
He goes back to the workshop, gets another vest.
He asked permission from a guard to leave the mechanic shop, stating that he had to recover some parts, and then he hops on the tractor, leaves.
Excuse me 1 second. Baker.
We received a call that a missing tractor had been found in a field east of the prison grounds, approximately 2 miles away from where the homicide occurred. Also found at the scene was a ID of Curtis Watson. That right there was the game changer. It was like, all right, not only do we have an escaped inmate, but is this escaped inmate the person responsible for the death of this lady?
Obviously, you know, whenever you have an escaped inmate, they're in survival mode and desperate.
It may be likely that the first contact with Curtis Watson might be made by some member of the public. It's going to be very important to law enforcement to get this information out.
In Tennessee, we have what's called the Blue Alert system. This is very similar to the Amber Alert system. A Blue Alert is where a law enforcement officer has either been seriously injured or killed in the line of duty. We issued the third Blue Alert in history of the state of Tennessee for the killer of Deborah Johnson.
Everybody's phone got those alerts, those screeching sounds. Usually when you hear there's a hurricane, there's a tornado.
Oh my God.
And when you read the alert, they was looking for the guy who killed my mom.
The family now know the truth. Deborah did not die from natural causes.
I'm just thinking, how did somebody get to her? Why wasn't nobody there to help her? Like, what did you do to my mama? Like, why is my mama not alive anymore? And who is responsible for this?
The killer's on the run.
At that moment, when I realized that she had been murdered, I'm thinking he rode off into the sunset on a tractor nonetheless. Do you know how slow tractors are? And he was able to ride off and live his life after murdering my mom. So in that moment, I was scared. I did not know where he was, what his motives were, who he was coming after next. We know that he was capable of doing this to my mom, then I'm sure he's capable of doing it again.
This is a large area, several hundred acres. If he was able, he could disappear in the woods for weeks.
We've had inmates that have escaped from West Tennessee Penitentiary that we didn't capture for years after.
We've had 0 sightings of this guy. We haven't seen him running through a field. No one's seen him going to a store. No one's seen him going into a barn. No one's seen him, period.
The longer that someone is missing, the harder they are to catch.
He's on the loose. You're worried about him committing another murder.
We believe he's heading east because east is really the only way away from the Mississippi River to basically civilization.
A blue alert is out right now for this guy, Curtis Watson.
We were pushing out his identity, his photograph, and reward money for his capture in an effort to get as much information out there as we could.
The TBI released these photos showing him just minutes before his escape.
Not only is it an escape, it's also a homicide. The media was all over this. It went nationwide instantly. I believe it even went worldwide.
Hundreds of law enforcement personnel are drafted in to track Watson down.
Troopers threw up checkpoints all across Lauderdale County, all after what the TBI says was the murder of prison official Deborah Johnson.
At a number of the intersections to Highway 51 and some of these country roads, they were interviewing the occupants of the car, checking to see if anybody was in the back seat. They were also checking that they weren't being controlled or otherwise threatened. And I do believe they were checking trunks to make sure that nobody was hidden in any of these vehicles.
Did he get in a car? You know, did he find a motorcycle at a hunting camp? Did he find a four-wheeler?
Investigators want to find out if Watson escaped the area earlier by car. There is only one main road close to the penitentiary, Tennessee State Route 87.
All the visitors, deliveries, so on, they have to go down this road. We're in a rural area, and the one thing we see more and more of every single day are residential cameras. Find every camera, find every bit of footage, let's review it and see what we can find.
They were checking every possible camera. Unfortunately, in a rural area, in a small town, you will see outside cameras, but then you go in to ask them to view it, and either it's not operational, it records over, like they don't maintain the footage, or it's a deterrent, but they don't record the footage.
Every once in a while, though, you get a home run and you find what you're looking for.
Baker finds a camera directly overlooking Route 87.
You'll pull that footage up.
He cues the footage up to just after 9 a.m.
We're hoping that this person is going to come into view.
Rewind. Freeze it. Zoom in.
We were kind of, you know, at the mercy of the technology. Unless you're focused in on a driver, you're never going to see who's driving. Especially in a moving vehicle.
Freeze it. Zoom in.
You might be able to determine whether it be male or female, possibly. But it's still very difficult. Unfortunately, it really doesn't help us. There was just nothing there that was suspicious.
The apprehension of any suspect is very important. You're worried that what is likely to happen will be bad. We believe he's willing to do anything, including harm one or more people, to continue his efforts to escape detection and arrest. So his motivation level to commit other crimes is very high. You've had hundreds of officers working in shifts, and they're doing something that they're not really used to doing. This is not pulling somebody over in a patrol car. This is a manhunt.
It's a wild goose chase to some extent. You're looking for a needle in a haystack.
The THP checkpoints will remain in place throughout Lauderdale County throughout the night.
They were working 24-hour days on very little sleep.
And it was hot, and it was muggy, and there were bugs everywhere. This went on for days.
More than 24 hours, and there is still no sign of an inmate who escaped the West Tennessee State Penitentiary.
The longer that you're in this intense search mode, with this amount of manpower, every day that you don't have a conclusion is disappointing.
I didn't know how long it was going to continue, right? At the day one, you're thinking, oh, God, they can't find him. Like, how can you not find a prisoner? I would literally sleep with a gun on my nightstand. I tried not to watch the media. I didn't want to see my mom's picture on the screen. I didn't want to see his picture because I was upset.
I felt like I was in the middle of a movie. You have escaped convict. He's on the run and everybody's digging for him. It's just like, this can't be life. This is not real.
I know for a fact that because it is Deborah Johnson, they're going to do everything they can to find this person and bring this person to justice. And I truly did believe that. Like, it's Deborah.
Where's your emergency?
There's somebody in my house, in my yard, just outside my bedroom.
A 911 call comes from a Henning resident. It says, hey, I've been notified by my camera, and I'm looking on camera, and there is a guy who I believe to be the suspect in this standing in my carport next to my refrigerator. I'm an hour and a half away. So we have agents who happen to luckily be there. They're on the scene very quickly.
By the time law enforcement arrive, the man has gone.
So I arrived on the scene. The first thing I want to do is see the video.
Play it again.
It shows a guy in the garage wearing camouflage clothing and his camouflage hat, carrying a backpack.
Can you play your second camera, please? Play it again.
He goes up to the refrigerator.
Freeze it.
You get to see his beard kind of in contrast to that white vehicle behind him.
Play it again.
Once he opens up the fridge, you can see the light shine on his face.
Freeze it. Can you zoom in on that frame? It's definitely Curtis Watson.
The video was that good. It was that clear. I mean, it shows Curtis Watson. Here he is, just a few miles away from where he originally escaped from. This is our first concrete lead that, hey, we have Curtis Watson spotted. We're seeing what he's wearing, what he's carrying, but really the beard, to me, the facial features, it's a match.
He was no longer in just standard prison gear. It looked like he was in survival mode. He's gotten a change of clothes to try to better suit being in the woods. He's certainly not afraid to walk up to a residence and take a chance on being captured on camera. He's having to take these risks to try to stay on the run.
Can you flip to the third camera, please?
They cue up the footage from the doorbell motion sensor camera.
Can you zoom in on that?
You can see he's clutching several items. He's in the process right here of stealing food and drink of some sort.
He's been out for several days. He's got to be hungry.
You know what he's wearing, you know what he looks like, and you know that his situation has been and still is pretty desperate. The family of this house would have been extremely concerned about the danger that he presented to them and to their neighbors.
These people carry guns. It's a very gun-friendly area. The opportunity for him to ascertain a weapon is very high. So that was one of our biggest fears, because now he's in a community. We immediately say, hey, this is it. All hands on deck. Everybody respond. Send the world. Every local agency in the area, all are responding to Henning, Tennessee.
10-4.
We had to catch him immediately, or else someone else was going to either be hurt or killed.
We couldn't really truly start to grieve and start that process of getting our thoughts together until he was caught.
This inmate has escaped. We have to find this inmate. So that's now the conversation that we have to have. And so we can't even sing my mom's praises and talk about how much of a wonderful person she was, because we're still looking for him.
My mom's gone, okay, that's something I had to deal with. But don't let anybody else have to bury their mom or dad or uncle, anything in that nature. Catch him before he harms anyone else.
Where's your emergency? Okay, and what's your location? I'm in Carolina Street in Henning, Tennessee. Okay, you have eyes on him? Yes, ma'am.
Some individuals, some Tennessee Department of Correction, had observed him in a field close by to where he was spotted on the camera. So they were able to call that in and then have law enforcement get in the area.
The stakes were high. Is this going to be a violent arrest? Is he going to attempt to flee?
Worst that could happen is that he has some type of weapon and he decides that he's going to try to go death by cop.
Does he pull out a gun? Does he start firing at civilians? Does he try to harm himself? How is this going to end? We weren't letting him leave the area. He knows that somebody could shoot him right then and there.
Curtis Watson, hands up, hands up!
We're doing what we have to do to get him into custody.
Get your hands up!
He knows he's caught. He is physically exhausted.
Hands up! Keep him up!
Once he realizes that their guns are trained on him and he cannot go anywhere, he gives up.
The handcuffs are on and he's in the back of the car.
He's got jungle rot on his feet. On every inch of his body, there's a mosquito bite. He is nasty. I'm looking at this monster. But the first thing I want to know in my head is, why did you do this? He did talk a little about the escape, kind of where he went, why he did what he did, things like that. But we never talked about the homicide of Miss Johnson. He refuses to talk about that.
Without a confession, authorities turned to the DNA evidence.
We were not able to recover any DNA from the vest. There was an additional search in this mechanic shop, and that's when they discovered Curtis Watson's boxers in the trash can.
He clearly believed that these were incriminating. As it turned out, they were. They contained some of his DNA, which was consistent with DNA that was found on the rape kit that was taken from Deborah Johnson.
Okay. Thank you for letting us know. You caught him.
It was a rare, happy moment for us as a family to be able to say, okay, well, at least we got the bastard who did this.
It gave us a sense of relief. Even though we were grieving, we were hurting, we knew we had each other.
I'm shaking. I realize even though the tears aren't coming, my body naturally is telling me this is traumatizing. It wasn't until then that I realized my mom is not here.
A week later, Deborah Johnson is laid to rest. An honorary convoy of police vehicles escort her.
My mother's funeral, it's unforgettable. She would have really felt appreciated, honored, and unworthy of all the praise that she got.
I knew she was gonna bring a lot of people out. My family members were shocked because she was so unassuming if you knew her. You wouldn't believe that she was so big.
She was very much loved, respected across the state of Tennessee by everybody she dealt with and everybody she touched.
It was like the little things that really, really hurt. Having to pick out her dress to wear in the funeral. Picking out the arrangement for on top of the casket. I wanted it to flow over the casket so I would feel like she's draped in flowers. And how the small details mattered. She would leave notes in my lunchbox. How the small details mattered. And so for me, it mattered what color we had on. It mattered that we all had purple flowers on. I wanted her to feel that she was loved because we felt that, you know?
In June 2021, Curtis Watson pleads guilty to rape and first-degree murder.
He left his housing unit that morning to go to work. He then arrived at his workshop, got on his vehicle, drove over to Miss Johnson's home.
The fight began at that point. I do believe that Deborah fought for her life. Whatever triggered him, only Curtis Watson knows the answer to that. After he had raped and murdered Deborah Johnson, Curtis Watson was getting rid of what he thought might be DNA evidence. He gets back on the golf cart.
He then left the area. We see him on the video camera meet up with the guard. He goes back to the workshop, changes some clothing, then again leaves the area on a tractor. The tractor is then later found 2 miles away, abandoned. And then the last time he's seen is 2 miles away on the video in Henning, Tennessee.
Curtis Watson is sentenced to life without parole.
It was a terrible crime. But I was glad that we, as an agency and our partners on the outside, were able to bring this person to justice. And he's going to sit in prison until the day he dies.
My Facebook status says, I'm Deborah's child, so you know how I am.
I'm a public school teacher. My sister is a nurse, and my younger brother is an assistant principal. So we all are in that public servant life for profession because of the upbringing we had through our mother. And I think that's just how God created her.
When I think about her, it's strength, it's consistency, it's love, it's equity, it's fairness. And hopefully I can be those things as I move forward and be
the best version of yourself and just do the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Honolulu is often remembered as a place of light, a place where the sun falls gently across the ocean, where the air carries the scent of salt and distant flowers, and where life appears to move at a slower, softer rhythm. But beneath that calm surface, beneath the image carefully preserved for visitors and outsiders, there was a different reality in 1931. It was a reality shaped not by the beauty of the land, but by the invisible lines that divided the people who lived upon it. Lines drawn by race, by power, and by who was allowed to define the truth. This is where the story begins. Not with a crime scene, but with a question. What happens when justice is no longer decided in a courtroom, but inside the minds of those who believe they have already found the truth? The case that would come to be known as the Massey case did not begin with a body. It began with a claim, a moment, a single voice that would set into motion a chain of events that no one could stop once it had begun. And at the center of it all were three people, bound together not by choice, but by circumstance and consequence. Talia Massey, a woman whose words would ignite outrage. Joseph Kahawai, a man whose life would be taken before he could fully defend it. And Thomas Massey, a husband who would decide that the law had failed him and that he would take its place. To understand what happened, you have to understand the world they lived in. Because this was not just a story about individuals. It was a story about a system, and what that system does when it is pushed to its limits. In 1931, Hawaii was not yet a state. It was a territory of the United States, governed not only by local authority, but heavily influenced by military presence and mainland interests. In Honolulu, this influence was impossible to ignore. The United States Navy had a strong foothold, and with it came a clear social hierarchy. At the top were white Americans, particularly those connected to the military. Their authority extended beyond their uniforms, shaping not only policy, but perception. Beneath them were the native Hawaiian population and immigrant communities, including those of Asian descent. They lived in the same city, walked the same streets, but did not exist on equal footing. This imbalance was not always visible at first glance. It did not always erupt into open conflict. But it was there, embedded in everyday interactions and assumptions, in the quiet decisions about who was believed and who was not. And then, on a night in September, something happened that forced those tensions into the open. On September 12, 1931, Talia Massey appeared in a state of visible distress. She reported that she had been abducted by a group of men, that she had been beaten, that she had been raped. Her account was immediate and shocking, and it spread quickly. In a place already shaped by imbalance, her words carried weight far beyond the details of the incident itself. She was the wife of a U.S. Navy officer. She represented not just herself, but a broader structure of authority. The reaction was swift. Law enforcement moved quickly, but they did not move in a vacuum. There was pressure, both spoken and unspoken. Pressure from the military. Pressure from a community that demanded resolution. The need to find those responsible became urgent, almost immediate. And in that urgency, a group of local men were identified and arrested. Among them was Joseph Kahawai. He was not a stranger pulled randomly from the streets. He was someone who would become almost instantly a symbol, not because of what had been proven, but because of what was believed. The evidence against him, as it would later become clear, was far from definitive. There was no solid physical proof tying him to the alleged crime. The identification process itself was uncertain. But in that moment, those details did not carry the same weight as the narrative that had already begun to form. The case moved to trial, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the system would function as it was meant to. Evidence would be examined. Testimonies would be questioned. A jury would decide. But the courtroom did not provide clarity. Instead, it exposed the fractures beneath the surface. The prosecution presented its case, relying heavily on the account given by Talia Massey. But inconsistencies began to emerge. Details that did not align perfectly. Identifications that were not entirely certain. The defense, in turn, highlighted these gaps, raising doubts about whether the accused could be definitively linked to the crime. There was no clear resolution. The jury deliberated, but could not reach a unanimous decision. The result was a deadlock. No conviction, no acquittal, just an absence of closure. And sometimes, that absence is more dangerous than any verdict. Because for some, a lack of conviction does not mean uncertainty. It means failure. It means that something has gone wrong, that justice has not been served, and that it must be corrected by other means. For Thomas Massey, that moment marked a turning point. He had watched as the system examined the case involving his wife and failed to produce a definitive outcome. He had seen the men accused walk away without conviction. And in that outcome, he did not see complexity or doubt. He saw injustice. What followed was not impulsive. It was not a sudden act carried out in the heat of a single moment. It was a decision, a deliberate shift from relying on the law to taking action outside of it. In January 1932, Joseph Kahahawai was taken. The act itself was bold, almost brazen. He was abducted near the courthouse, a place meant to symbolize order and justice. There was no attempt to disguise the intent behind what was happening. He was forced into a car, removed from any possibility of legal protection, and placed into a situation where the outcome was already being shaped by those who controlled it. Inside that car, the rules were different. There were no procedures, no safeguards, no requirement to prove anything beyond what was already believed. The goal was not to investigate. It was to extract, to force a confession, to confirm a narrative that had already been accepted. Violence became a tool. And in that confined space, with no way to escape, Joseph Kahahawai was subjected to that violence. The exact sequence of moments that followed can never be fully reconstructed. But the result is known. He was shot. His life ended not in a courtroom, not after a trial, but in the back of a car, under circumstances where his guilt had never been definitively established. Afterward, there was an attempt to control the story, to present what had happened as something else, as self-defense, as a necessary act. But the facts could not be entirely concealed. The abduction had been too visible, the sequence of events too clear. The people responsible were identified. They were arrested. And once again, the case moved into the legal system. But this time, the roles had shifted. The men who had once demanded justice were now the ones being judged. And the question that had lingered beneath the surface of the entire case became impossible to ignore. Was justice ever truly the goal? Or had it been replaced somewhere along the way by something else entirely? Because what had begun as an accusation had turned into a killing. What had started as a search for truth had ended in an act that bypassed truth altogether. And now, the system that had been accused of failing would be asked to decide the fate of those who had taken its place. The outcome of that decision would not just determine the future of the individuals involved. It would reveal something deeper, something more unsettling. It would show what happens when power and belief collide with uncertainty, and whether justice, once compromised, can ever truly be restored. In order to understand how a single accusation could unravel into a killing that would divide an entire society, it is necessary to step back and look closely at the world in which these events took place. Honolulu in 1930 was not simply a geographic location. It was a structure, carefully layered, defined not only by culture and history, but by hierarchy. People lived side by side, yet not as equals. Their experiences were shaped not just by who they were, but by how they were seen within a system that quietly determined whose voice carried weight and whose did not. At the top of that system were white Americans, particularly those connected to the United States military. Their presence in Hawaii was not incidental. It was institutional, reinforced by political authority and strategic importance. The Navy was not only a defensive force, but a symbol of influence, and those associated with it occupied a position that extended beyond uniform and rank. Their perspectives were often treated as credible by default, their concerns urgent, their grievances legitimate before they were even examined. This did not always manifest as overt dominance. More often, it appeared in subtle ways, in assumptions that went unquestioned, in decisions that seemed natural to those making them. Below this layer were the native Hawaiian population and immigrant communities, including many of Asian descent. Their lives were intertwined with the same land, the same economy, and the same public spaces, yet their position was markedly different. They were subject to the same laws, but not always to the same interpretations of those laws. Their voices could be heard, but not always believed. In times of calm, this imbalance could remain unspoken, masked by routine and coexistence. But when something disrupted that balance, when an incident demanded accountability, those divisions became impossible to ignore. It was within this environment that the individuals at the center of the case emerged, each shaped by the world around them, each carrying roles that would influence how they were perceived long before any evidence was presented. Joseph Kahahawai was a young native Hawaiian man, one of several individuals who would suddenly find themselves pulled into a case that would define their lives. Before his arrest, he was not widely known beyond his own community. There was nothing in the available information that marked him as someone destined to become the focus of a national controversy. And yet, when the accusation was made, he became precisely that. Not because of what had been proven, but because of how quickly suspicion settled upon him and others like him. His identity, his background, and his place within the social structure of Honolulu all played a role in how he was viewed once he was named as a suspect. He was not alone. Other local men were also arrested, grouped together under the same accusation, forming a collective narrative that was easier to present than a fragmented and uncertain one. In that grouping, individuality was diminished. The details that might have distinguished one person from another became less important than the broader image that had already begun to take shape. For Joseph Kahahawai, this meant that his fate would be tied not only to the evidence, but to the assumptions that surrounded him. On the other side of the case was Talia Massey, a woman whose words would become the foundation of everything that followed. She was the wife of a United States Navy officer, and in the context of Honolulu at the time, that status carried significant weight. Her position within the social hierarchy meant that her voice would not be treated as one among many. It would be amplified, given attention, and taken seriously from the moment it was heard. When she appeared and described what she said had happened to her, the impact was immediate. Her account was not just a personal statement. It was interpreted as an attack that demanded response, not only because of its nature, but because of who she was. The details she provided would later be examined and questioned, with inconsistencies noted and uncertainties raised. But in the initial moments, before those questions could be fully explored, her words set the direction of the investigation. Her emotional state, described as distressed and shaken, reinforced the urgency of the situation. It created a sense that something violent and undeniable had occurred, even as the specifics remained unclear. This combination of status and presentation contributed to a powerful narrative, one that would shape how others reacted, including law enforcement and the broader community. Between these two individuals stood Thomas H. Massey, a man whose actions would ultimately redefine the course of the case. As a Navy officer, he embodied the authority and influence associated with the military presence in Hawaii. But beyond that, he was a husband responding to what he believed had been done to his wife. That dual role placed him in a position where personal emotion and institutional power intersected. From the moment the accusation was made, his perspective was clear. He believed that a crime had occurred and that those responsible needed to be held accountable. When the legal process began, he looked to it for resolution, expecting that it would confirm what he already believed to be true. But when that process failed to produce a conviction, when the jury could not reach a decision, his confidence in the system began to erode. This erosion did not happen in isolation. It was reinforced by the broader environment, by voices that echoed his frustration, by a sense within certain parts of the community that the outcome of the trial represented not uncertainty, but failure. The idea that the accused could walk free without a clear verdict was, to them, unacceptable. It suggested that something had gone wrong, that the system had not functioned as it should. For Thomas Massey, this perception became a turning point. It transformed the situation from one in which he was waiting for justice to be delivered into one in which he began to consider whether justice would need to be taken. The tension between these perspectives created the central conflict of the case. On one side was the legal system, imperfect but structured, designed to evaluate evidence and reach conclusions based on established procedures. On the other side was a growing belief that those procedures had failed, that they were insufficient in the face of what was perceived as a clear wrong. Joseph Kahahawai existed at the intersection of this conflict. He was both an individual and a symbol, both a person with his own life and a figure onto whom broader fears and assumptions were projected. His identity made him vulnerable within the system, while the lack of definitive evidence made his position legally uncertain. This combination placed him in a precarious situation, one where his fate would depend not only on what could be proven, but on what others were willing to believe. At the same time, Talia Massey's account remained the central piece of the narrative, even as questions began to surface. The inconsistencies in her testimony did not immediately dismantle the case against the accused, but they introduced doubt. That doubt, however, did not affect all parties equally. For some, it was enough to question the entire foundation of the accusation. For others, it was seen as a complication rather than a contradiction, something that did not erase the core belief that a crime had occurred. This divergence in interpretation deepened the divide within the community. It was no longer simply a question of what had happened on a single night. It became a question of whose perspective would define reality. Would it be the perspective supported by legal standards of evidence, or the one driven by conviction and belief? As these questions remained unresolved, the atmosphere in Honolulu grew increasingly tense. The case had moved beyond the individuals directly involved and had begun to reflect broader issues within the society. It highlighted the imbalance of power, the fragility of trust in the legal system, and the ways in which identity could influence both perception and outcome. By the time the first trial ended without a verdict, the stage had been set for what would come next. The lack of resolution did not bring closure. Instead, it created a vacuum, one that would soon be filled by actions that would push the situation beyond the boundaries of law and into something far more dangerous. In that moment, the roles of victim and accused, of justice and revenge, began to blur. And as they did, the lives of those at the center of the case moved closer to a point from which there would be no return. The events that followed unfolded not as a single moment, but as a sequence of escalating reactions, each shaped by what had come before and by the growing pressure to reach a conclusion. What began on the night of September 12, 1931, did not immediately resemble the kind of case that would later define an entire era of tension. It began, instead, with uncertainty, with fragments of a story that demanded interpretation. When Talia Massey appeared and described what she said had happened to her, the response was immediate and intense. She was visibly distressed, and her account carried a sense of urgency that was difficult to ignore. According to her statement, she had been taken against her will by a group of men, physically assaulted, and subjected to a violent attack. The nature of the allegation ensured that it would not remain a private matter. It quickly became a public issue, one that demanded action from authorities and drew attention from both the civilian population and the military presence in Honolulu. In the early stages, there was little time for careful reflection. The priority was to identify those responsible, to show that the system could respond decisively. Law enforcement began their work under significant pressure, not only to investigate, but to produce results. This pressure influenced the speed at which suspects were identified and detained. A group of local men was arrested, brought into custody based on suspicion that aligned with the narrative that had already begun to take shape. Among them was Joseph Kahahawai. The arrests created a sense of progress, a visible sign that action was being taken. But beneath that appearance, questions remained. The evidence connecting the suspects to the alleged crime was not strong in a definitive sense. There was no clear physical proof that could establish guilt beyond doubt. The case relied heavily on identification and testimony, both of which carried uncertainties that would later become central to the proceedings. As the investigation moved forward, these uncertainties did not immediately slow its pace. Instead, they became part of a process that continued toward trial. The case entered the courtroom with an expectation that the missing clarity would emerge through formal examination, that testimony would align, and that the truth would become evident through structured questioning and legal scrutiny. But the courtroom did not provide the resolution that many expected. During the trial, the prosecution presented the account given by Talia Massey as the central piece of evidence. Her testimony described the events as she remembered them, conveying the fear and violence she claimed to have experienced. However, as her statements were examined more closely, inconsistencies began to surface. Details did not always align perfectly from one account to another. Elements of identification were uncertain, raising questions about whether the accused could be reliably connected to the incident. The defense focused on these inconsistencies, emphasizing the absence of physical evidence and the lack of certainty in the identification process. They argued that without clear proof, the accusations could not support a conviction. This created a dynamic in which the case was no longer defined solely by the severity of the allegation, but by the reliability of the information used to support it. The jury was placed in a difficult position. They were asked to weigh a serious accusation against a body of evidence that did not fully confirm it. The emotional weight of the case was significant, but the legal standard required certainty. As deliberations continued, it became clear that agreement would not be reached. Some jurors were convinced by the testimony, while others were not satisfied that the evidence met the necessary threshold. The result was a deadlock. There was no verdict, no definitive answer. The trial ended not with resolution, but with uncertainty. For the legal system, this outcome reflected the complexity of the case. It acknowledged that the available evidence did not allow for a clear conclusion. But outside the courtroom, the reaction was very different. For many, particularly those aligned with the Massey family and the military community, the lack of a conviction was not seen as a reflection of uncertainty. It was interpreted as a failure. The idea that the accused could leave the courtroom without being found guilty was viewed as unacceptable, as though the absence of a verdict had allowed injustice to prevail. This perception created a shift in the way the situation was understood. The focus moved away from the limitations of the evidence and toward a belief that the system itself had not functioned properly. The trial had not produced the outcome that some expected, and in that gap between expectation and reality, frustration began to grow. For Thomas H. Massey, this moment carried particular significance. He had entered the process with the expectation that it would confirm what he believed had happened to his wife. When that confirmation did not come, when the legal process ended without a clear determination of guilt, his confidence in the system was deeply shaken. The absence of a verdict did not create doubt in his mind. Instead, it reinforced his belief that justice had been denied. This belief did not remain abstract. It began to influence decisions, to shape the way forward. The idea that the system had failed created space for another approach, one that did not rely on legal procedures or standards of proof. It introduced the possibility that justice, as he understood it, could be pursued outside the boundaries of the law. At the same time, the accused men, including Joseph Kahahawai, found themselves in a precarious position. They had not been convicted, but neither had they been fully cleared in the eyes of the public. The absence of a verdict left them in a state of uncertainty, where suspicion lingered even without formal judgment. Their lives continued under the shadow of the accusation, affected by perceptions that had not been resolved. This tension between legal uncertainty and personal conviction continued to build in the weeks that followed the trial. The case remained present in public consciousness, discussed and debated, its unresolved nature allowing different interpretations to persist. Each side held to its own version of events, supported not only by evidence, but by broader beliefs about justice and fairness. As time passed, the lack of closure did not lead to calm. Instead, it intensified the sense that something still needed to be done. The formal process had ended, but the underlying conflict remained active, waiting for a catalyst that would push it into a new and more dangerous phase. That catalyst would come in January 1932. By that point, the situation had evolved beyond a legal dispute. It had become a matter of principle for those who believed that the system had failed. The decision that followed was not made in the open, not debated within the structures designed to handle such cases. It was made privately, driven by a conviction that action was necessary and justified. When Joseph Kahahawai was taken near the courthouse, the act marked a clear departure from everything that had come before. It was no longer about presenting evidence or arguing within a legal framework. It was about control, about removing the process from the system that had been rejected and placing it in the hands of those who believed they already knew the truth. The abduction itself was direct, leaving little room for ambiguity. It occurred in a space associated with justice, emphasizing the contrast between what the system represented and what was about to happen outside of it. Kahahawai was forced into a car, taken from a place where his rights were at least formally recognized into an environment where those rights no longer applied. Inside that confined space, the purpose of the act became clear. It was not an investigation in the legal sense. It was an attempt to extract a confession, to force an admission that would validate the belief that had taken hold after the trial. The methods used reflected this purpose. They were not guided by rules or oversight, but by the urgency to confirm what had already been decided. The situation escalated quickly. The use of violence, intended to compel a response, moved beyond control. In that environment, without the constraints of law or procedure, there was nothing to prevent the outcome from becoming fatal. Joseph Kahahawai was shot. His death brought a sudden and irreversible end to the uncertainty that had surrounded him. It did not resolve the questions of guilt or innocence. Instead, it replaced those questions with a new reality, one in which the focus would shift from the original accusation to the act that had just taken place. Afterward, there was an effort to shape how the event would be understood. The narrative of self-defense was introduced, an attempt to frame the killing in a way that could be justified. But the circumstances made this difficult to sustain. The abduction had been deliberate. The sequence of events pointed to an action that had been initiated with intent, not as a response to immediate danger. The authorities moved in, and those responsible were arrested. The case, which had begun with one accusation, now expanded to include another, one that was clearer in its physical reality, but still deeply entangled in the same underlying tensions. The stage was set for a second trial, one that would not only examine the actions of those who had taken the law into their own hands, but also confront the broader issues that had led to that moment. What had started as an unresolved allegation had become a confirmed act of violence. And now, the system that had been questioned would be asked to respond once again. The killing of Joseph Kahahawai did not end the case. In many ways, it transformed it. What had once been an investigation into an alleged crime now became an inquiry into an act that had unfolded in plain terms, with identifiable participants and a sequence of events that could be traced. Yet even as the facts surrounding the abduction and killing appeared more concrete than the original accusation, the path toward understanding what had happened was far from straightforward. The same forces that had shaped the earlier stages of the case remained present, influencing how the new investigation would proceed and how its findings would be interpreted. When authorities began to reconstruct the events of January 1932, they were no longer dealing with uncertainty in the same way they had before. The abduction had taken place in a public setting near the courthouse, and it had been carried out with a level of visibility that made it difficult to deny. Witnesses could place Joseph Kahahawai at a specific location before he was taken. The movement from that point into the vehicle was not a matter of speculation. It was an observable act, one that established the beginning of a chain of events that would lead to his death. From there, the focus shifted to what had occurred inside the car. Unlike the earlier allegation involving Talia Massey, which depended heavily on a single account, this stage of the investigation involved multiple individuals whose actions were connected. The group that had taken Kahahawai included Thomas H. Massey, his mother-in-law, and 2 associates. Their involvement was not hidden in the same way that the original alleged attackers had been. Instead, it was tied to a deliberate decision that had been made following the unresolved trial. Investigators worked to piece together the sequence of events, examining how Kahahawai had been taken, what had happened during the time he was in the car, and how his death had occurred. The purpose of the abduction became a central point of inquiry. It was clear that the act had not been random. It had been directed at a specific individual who had previously been accused but not convicted. This connection provided context, linking the killing directly to the earlier case and to the dissatisfaction that had followed its outcome. Within the confined space of the vehicle, the dynamic was markedly different from anything that could occur within a courtroom. There were no formal procedures, no requirement to adhere to legal standards of evidence. Instead, the environment was shaped by the intentions of those present. According to the available information, the goal was to force a confession, to obtain an admission that would validate the belief that Kahahawai had been responsible for the alleged crime against Talia Massey. The use of violence as a means of achieving that goal was a critical element of the investigation. It demonstrated that the situation had moved beyond an attempt to seek clarification and had entered the realm of coercion. This shift had significant implications. It indicated that the outcome being sought was not an objective understanding of the truth, but a confirmation of a predetermined conclusion. In this context, any statement obtained under such conditions would be inherently questionable, shaped as much by the circumstances of its extraction as by any underlying reality. As investigators examined the evidence, they encountered the explanation that had been put forward by those involved in the killing. The claim of self-defense was presented as a way to frame the events in a manner that could be legally justified. According to this narrative, the situation had escalated in a way that necessitated the use of lethal force. However, when this claim was compared to the established sequence of events, it raised significant questions. The act of abducting Kahahawai near the courthouse suggested premeditation rather than spontaneity. It indicated that the encounter had been initiated by those who later claimed to have acted in self-defense. This contradiction was central to the investigation. It required authorities to consider whether the explanation provided could be reconciled with the observable facts, or whether it was an attempt to reshape the narrative after the fact. The presence of multiple individuals involved in the abduction further complicated the situation. Each person's role had to be examined, their actions understood in relation to the others. The group dynamic suggested coordination, a shared purpose that extended beyond a single individual's reaction. This raised additional questions about intent and responsibility. Was the act of violence a collective decision, or did it emerge from a moment that escalated beyond control? The answer to this question would have implications for how the case would be prosecuted. At the same time, the investigation could not be separated from the broader context in which it was taking place. The earlier trial had already exposed divisions within the community, and those divisions persisted. The killing of Kahahawai did not occur in isolation. It was directly linked to the unresolved tensions surrounding the original accusation. As a result, the investigation into his death was influenced not only by the facts of the case, but by the interpretations that different groups brought to those facts. For some, the actions of Thomas Massey and the others involved were seen as a continuation of a pursuit of justice, however flawed. They were viewed through the lens of the earlier allegation, with the belief that they were responding to a wrong that had not been addressed by the legal system. For others, the killing represented a clear violation of the law, an act that could not be justified regardless of the circumstances that had preceded it. These differing perspectives created an environment in which the investigation was not only about determining what had happened, but also about how those events would be understood. Authorities faced the challenge of navigating these competing interpretations while maintaining a focus on the evidence. The physical reality of the killing could not be ignored. A man had been taken against his will and had died as a result of actions taken by those who had assumed control over his fate. This fact provided a foundation for the case, a point of certainty in a situation otherwise marked by ambiguity. As the investigation progressed, the narrative that had initially been shaped by the claim of self-defense began to weaken. The circumstances of the abduction, the use of coercion, and the fatal outcome all pointed toward an act that had been initiated and carried out outside the boundaries of lawful conduct. This did not eliminate the influence of the earlier case, but it shifted the focus toward the actions that could be directly examined and evaluated. The decision to move forward with charges reflected this shift. The individuals involved in the killing were no longer positioned as victims seeking justice. They were now defendants, subject to the same legal system that had previously failed to deliver the outcome they had expected. This reversal of roles underscored the complexity of the situation, highlighting the way in which the pursuit of one form of justice had led to the violation of another. At the same time, the investigation left certain questions unresolved. The original allegation made by Talia Massey remained uncertain, its details still subject to doubt. The killing of Kahahawai did not clarify those uncertainties. Instead, it introduced a new set of facts that demanded attention, effectively overshadowing the initial case without resolving it. This duality became a defining feature of the situation. On one level, there was a clear act of violence that could be examined through evidence and testimony. On another level, there was an unresolved question about the events that had triggered the entire sequence. The investigation had to proceed within this framework, addressing the tangible aspects of the case, while acknowledging the broader context that continued to influence it. As preparations began for the trial that would follow, the focus remained on the actions that had led to Kahahawai's death. The evidence gathered during the investigation would form the basis of the prosecution's case, while the defense would seek to present an alternative interpretation of those same events. The outcome would depend not only on the facts themselves, but on how they were presented and understood within a system that had already been tested by the earlier proceedings. The investigation, therefore, served as both a continuation and a transformation of the case. It built upon the unresolved tensions of the past while introducing new elements that would shape its future. In doing so, it set the stage for a trial that would not only determine the fate of those involved, but also reflect the broader issues that had brought the situation to this point. The second trial began under a weight that extended far beyond the individuals seated in the courtroom. By the time proceedings opened, the case had already become a reflection of something larger than a single act of violence. It carried with it the unresolved tensions of the earlier accusation, the public reaction to the deadlocked jury, and the undeniable reality that a man had been taken and killed by those who believed they were acting in the name of justice. The courtroom was no longer simply a place where facts would be examined. It had become a space where competing ideas about justice, authority, and responsibility would confront each other directly. At the center of the trial were Thomas H. Massey and the others who had participated in the abduction and killing of Joseph Kahahawai. Unlike the earlier proceedings, where uncertainty dominated, this case presented a set of actions that were not in dispute. The defendants had taken Kahahawai from near the courthouse. They had placed him in a vehicle. During that confinement, violence had been used, and he had been shot and killed. These elements formed the foundation of the prosecution's case, providing a sequence of events that could be clearly outlined and supported by evidence. The prosecution approached the case with an emphasis on these concrete facts. Their argument did not depend on reconstructing an uncertain event or relying on inconsistent testimony. Instead, it focused on what could be established with clarity. A man had been abducted. He had been deprived of his liberty. He had been subjected to coercion. And he had died as a result. Each of these points was presented as part of a deliberate chain of actions, one that demonstrated intent and responsibility. Central to this argument was the rejection of the claim of self-defense. The prosecution emphasized that the encounter had not been spontaneous. It had begun with an act of abduction, initiated by the defendants. This act, they argued, undermined any assertion that the killing had occurred in response to an immediate threat. By removing Kahahawai from a public space and placing him in a controlled environment, the defendants had created the circumstances in which the fatal outcome occurred. In this context, the use of lethal force could not be separated from the initial decision to take him against his will. The defense, however, presented a different perspective. While they did not deny that Kahahawai had been taken or that he had died, they sought to reframe the meaning of those actions. Their argument centered on the idea that the defendants were responding to a failure of the legal system. They pointed to the earlier trial, to the deadlocked jury, and to the belief that justice had not been served. Within this framework, the abduction was portrayed not as an act of criminal intent, but as an attempt to obtain the truth that the system had failed to uncover. This framing extended to the events within the car. The defense argued that the situation had escalated in a way that could not have been fully anticipated. They suggested that the use of force, while regrettable, had arisen from a moment of confrontation, one in which the defendants believed they were facing resistance or danger. The claim of self-defense was integrated into this narrative, positioned as a reaction to circumstances that had developed beyond their control. The contrast between these two perspectives defined the trial. On one side was a straightforward presentation of actions and consequences, emphasizing the sequence that led from abduction to death. On the other side was an attempt to contextualize those actions within a broader narrative of perceived injustice, to suggest that the defendant's behavior could not be understood in isolation from the events that had preceded it. As the trial progressed, these arguments were examined in detail. The evidence presented by the prosecution reinforced the clarity of the sequence of events. The location of the abduction, near the courthouse, highlighted the deliberate nature of the act. The use of coercion within the car demonstrated a willingness to bypass legal processes in pursuit of a specific outcome. The fatal shooting, occurring within this context, was presented as the culmination of decisions that had been made step by step. At the same time, the defense continued to emphasize the emotional and situational factors that had influenced those decisions. They pointed to the defendant's belief that they were seeking justice, that they were responding to a situation in which the system had failed to protect them. This argument did not challenge the factual basis of the case as much as it sought to alter its interpretation, to introduce a layer of understanding that might mitigate the perception of intent. The jury was once again placed in a position of weighing not only evidence, but meaning. Unlike the first trial, where the absence of clear proof had led to a deadlock, this case presented a clearer factual foundation. The question was not whether the events had occurred, but how they should be classified within the framework of the law. Should the actions of the defendants be seen as a deliberate and unjustified killing, or as a lesser offense shaped by the circumstances that had led to it? When the verdict was reached, it reflected a compromise between these competing views. The defendants were not found guilty of murder. Instead, they were convicted of manslaughter. This distinction was significant. It acknowledged that a crime had been committed, that the killing of Joseph Kahahawai was not justified within the boundaries of a law. At the same time, it suggested that the jury had accepted, at least in part, the idea that the circumstances surrounding the case reduced the level of culpability. The sentence that followed appeared to reinforce the seriousness of a conviction. The defendants were given 10-year prison terms, a punishment that indicated recognition of the gravity of their actions. On the surface, this outcome suggested that the legal system had reasserted itself, that it had responded to the violation of its authority by imposing consequences on those responsible. However, the case did not end with the verdict. What followed would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire upon, a decision that would alter the meaning of the trial's outcome and intensify the divisions that had been present from the beginning. The governor of Hawaii at the time, Lawrence M. Judd, intervened. Using his authority, he commuted the sentences of the defendants. The 10-year prison terms were reduced to a period of 1 hour of confinement. This decision transformed what had been a substantial punishment into a symbolic gesture, one that effectively allowed the defendants to walk free after a minimal and largely procedural detention. The impact of this decision was immediate and profound. It altered the perception of the trial's outcome, shifting it from a demonstration of accountability to an example of leniency that many found difficult to reconcile with the facts of the case. The conviction remained in place, but the punishment associated with it no longer reflected the severity of the crime as it had been presented during the trial. For some, this decision was seen as an extension of the same beliefs that had driven the defendants' actions. It suggested that their perspective, their sense of having been wronged by the earlier trial, had influenced not only their own behavior, but the response of those in positions of authority. The reduction of the sentence was interpreted as a validation of their actions, or at least as an acknowledgement that they were not to be treated in the same way as others who might have committed a similar crime. For others, the commutation represented a failure of the system at its highest level. It undermined the outcome of the trial, raising questions about whether the legal process could produce meaningful consequences when those consequences could be so dramatically altered. The decision highlighted the extent to which power could shape not only the interpretation of events, but the application of justice itself. In the end, the trial and its outcome did not resolve the tensions that had defined the case. Instead, they reinforced them. The conviction of manslaughter acknowledged that a wrong had been committed, but the commutation of the sentence suggested that the response to that wrong was not equal to its impact. The legal system had acted, but its actions had been modified in a way that left many questioning its integrity. The courtroom proceedings had provided structure, had created a space in which arguments could be presented and evaluated. But the final result, shaped by forces beyond that space, demonstrated that the resolution of the case was not determined solely within its walls. It was influenced by the same dynamics that had been present from the beginning, by the interplay of belief, authority, and the persistent question of what justice should look like when certainty remains out of reach. The conclusion of the trial did not bring an end to the case. If anything, it marked the beginning of a different kind of reckoning, one that extended beyond the courtroom and into the fabric of the society that had watched every stage of the events unfold. The legal process had delivered a verdict, and that verdict had been altered by executive intervention, reducing a significant sentence to a symbolic act. On paper, the case was resolved. In reality, it remained deeply unsettled. The immediate reaction revealed how divided Honolulu had become. For many within the native Hawaiian community, the outcome confirmed a fear that had existed long before the events of 1931 and 1932. It reinforced the belief that the system did not operate equally for everyone, that the application of justice could shift depending on who stood before it. The killing of Joseph Kahahawai was not viewed simply as an isolated act of violence. It was seen as the culmination of a process in which an individual had been accused without definitive proof, placed at the center of public suspicion, and ultimately deprived of his life, without the protections that the legal system was meant to provide. The fact that those responsible faced only minimal consequences deepened that perception, transforming the case into a symbol of imbalance. This response was not driven solely by the details of the verdict or the commutation of the sentence. It was rooted in a broader experience, in the accumulated understanding of how authority and credibility were distributed within the society. The events of the case appeared to confirm that those at the top of the social hierarchy could act with a degree of protection that others did not possess. The distinction between legal judgment and personal belief, which had been at the center of the earlier trial, seemed to have been resolved not in favor of evidence, but in favor of power. At the same time, there were those who interpreted the outcome differently. Some saw the actions of Thomas H. Massey and the others involved not as a rejection of justice, but as a response to its perceived failure. In this view, the original accusation made by Talia Massey remained the defining element of the case. The lack of a conviction in the first trial was seen as an error, an instance in which the system had been unable to deliver a result that aligned with what was believed to be true. From this perspective, the abduction and killing of Joseph Kahahawai, while extreme, were understood as actions taken under extraordinary circumstances. The commutation of the sentence was then interpreted as an acknowledgement of those circumstances, a recognition that the case could not be reduced to a simple application of the law. These competing interpretations ensured that the case would not fade into the background. It remained a point of reference, a moment that people returned to when discussing the nature of justice and the role of authority. It highlighted the difficulty of separating individual actions from the context in which they occur, and it demonstrated how deeply that context can influence the way events are understood. Beyond the immediate reactions, the case also had a lasting impact on how the legal system itself was perceived. The first trial had already raised questions about the ability of the system to produce clear outcomes in complex situations. The deadlocked jury had reflected the uncertainty inherent in the evidence, but it had also left many dissatisfied. The second trial, with its more concrete set of facts, seemed to offer an opportunity to restore confidence, to show that the system could respond effectively when the circumstances were clearer. However, the commutation of the sentence altered that perception. It suggested that even when the system reached a conclusion, that conclusion could be reshaped by factors outside the courtroom. The authority to reduce the sentence rested with the governor, and its use in this case demonstrated the extent to which legal outcomes could be influenced by broader considerations. This raised difficult questions about the balance between legal procedure and executive power, and about the extent to which justice could be considered consistent when its final form depended on decisions made beyond the trial itself. The unresolved nature of the original accusation continued to cast a shadow over everything that followed. The question of whether Talia Massey had in fact been attacked remained unanswered in any definitive sense. The inconsistencies in her testimony, the lack of physical evidence, and the uncertainty of the identification process meant that the case had never reached a clear conclusion. This ambiguity did not disappear after the killing of Kahawai. Instead, it became intertwined with it, creating a situation in which two separate uncertainties existed side by side. On one level, there was the question of what had happened on the night of September 12, 1931. On another, there was the question of how to understand the actions that had led to Kahawai's death. These questions were connected, but they could not be resolved in the same way. The first lacked sufficient evidence to produce a definitive answer. The second involved actions that were clear, but whose meaning remained contested. This dual uncertainty contributed to the enduring impact of the case. It prevented a simple narrative from taking hold, one in which events could be neatly categorized and understood. Instead, it required a more complex engagement, an acknowledgement that the truth might not be fully accessible, and that the search for it could have consequences that extend beyond the initial question. In this sense, the case can be understood as a form of social tension made visible. It exposed the underlying structures that shaped the society in which it occurred, bringing to the surface issues that might otherwise have remained unspoken. It showed how quickly a situation could escalate when those structures were challenged, and how difficult it could be to restore balance once they had been disrupted. The idea of justice, which had been central from the beginning, emerged from the case in a fragmented form. For some, justice had not been achieved because a man had been killed without due process and those responsible had not been meaningfully punished. For others, justice had been compromised earlier when the legal system failed to convict those accused of a serious crime. These perspectives were not easily reconciled, and their coexistence ensured that the case would remain a source of debate. What makes the case particularly unsettling is not the violence itself, but the way in which that violence was connected to a belief in righteousness. The individuals who carried out the abduction and killing did not act in secrecy or without justification in their own minds. They acted with a sense of purpose, convinced that they were correcting an error. This conviction, combined with the subsequent reduction of their sentence, creates a situation in which the boundaries between right and wrong become difficult to define in a clear and consistent way. For Joseph Kahawai, the outcome was absolute. His life ended as a result of actions taken outside the protections of the legal system. The questions surrounding his alleged involvement in the original accusation remain unanswered, leaving his role in the case defined not by a verdict, but by the circumstances of his death. This absence of resolution adds another layer to the case, emphasizing the gap between what is known and what can be proven. In the years that followed, the case continued to be discussed as an example of the challenges inherent in administering justice within a divided society. It serves as a reminder that legal systems do not operate in isolation, that they are influenced by the environments in which they exist and by the people who interact with them. It also highlights the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between personal belief and legal authority and the consequences that can arise when those boundaries are crossed. Ultimately, the case does not offer a simple conclusion. It does not resolve the questions it raises or provide a definitive account of what happened at every stage. Instead, it leaves behind a set of tensions that continue to resonate. It asks whether justice can truly function when trust in the system is uneven, and whether actions taken in the name of justice can ever be justified when they abandon the principles that define it. In this way, the legacy of the case lies not in the answers it provides, but in the questions it leaves behind. In the years that followed, the case did not disappear into history as a closed chapter. Instead, it lingered, resurfacing in conversations, in legal discussions, and in the collective memory of a place that had been forced to confront its own contradictions. What made the Massey case endure was not only the sequence of events, but the way those events resisted a single, stable interpretation. It became a reference point not because it offered clarity, but because it exposed how fragile clarity can be when truth, perception, and power intersect. As time passed, the individuals at the center of the case gradually receded from public life, but their roles remained fixed within the narrative that had been constructed around them. Talia Massey continued to exist in the story as the origin point, the voice that had set everything in motion. Her account, with all its uncertainties and inconsistencies, remained unresolved. It was never definitively proven, yet it was never fully dismissed. It occupied a space that was neither confirmed nor denied, and in that ambiguity, it retained its influence. Every discussion of the case inevitably returned to her statement, not because it provided answers, but because it framed the questions that followed. Thomas H. Massey, in contrast, became associated with the consequences of action taken in the absence of certainty. His decision to move beyond the legal system and take control of what he believed to be justice marked a shift that could not be undone. Even after the trial, even after the sentence was reduced and the immediate legal consequences were minimized, the implications of that decision remained. It demonstrated how quickly the boundary between belief and authority can collapse when confidence in institutions is lost. His actions were not isolated in their impact. They influenced how others understood the limits of lawful behavior, particularly in situations where the outcome of legal processes is unsatisfactory. Joseph Kahahawai's presence in the narrative, however, was defined by absence. His death removed him from the possibility of ever fully participating in the resolution of the case. He could not testify further, could not respond to the accusations that had been made, and could not contribute to the ongoing debate about what had happened. His role became symbolic, representing both the vulnerability of individuals within a contested system and the consequences of decisions made without definitive proof. The lack of closure surrounding his alleged involvement in the original accusation ensured that his death would always be viewed through a lens of uncertainty. As the case continued to be examined, it became clear that its significance extended beyond the specific details of what had occurred. It began to be used as an example in broader discussions about the nature of justice, particularly in societies marked by inequality. The events in Honolulu highlighted how legal systems can be influenced by social dynamics and how those dynamics can shape not only outcomes, but the perception of those outcomes. The disparity between the severity of the crime and the leniency of the punishment became a focal point, raising questions about whether justice had been applied consistently or whether it had been altered by considerations that lay outside the evidence presented in court. This perception had lasting effects on trust. For those who already felt marginalized within the system, the case reinforced a sense of distance from the institutions that were meant to protect them. It suggested that access to justice was not evenly distributed and that the outcomes of legal proceedings could be influenced by factors unrelated to the facts of the case. This erosion of trust did not occur all at once. It developed gradually, shaped by both the immediate events and the way those events were remembered and retold. At the same time, the case also influenced how authority figures approached similar situations in the future. It served as a reminder of the potential consequences when public pressure and institutional expectations intersect. The rapid response to the initial accusation, the speed with which suspects were identified, and the subsequent failure to secure a conviction all demonstrated the challenges of balancing urgency with accuracy. The decision by the governor to reduce the sentence further illustrated how authority can extend beyond the courtroom, affecting the final outcome in ways that may not align with the original intent of the legal process. In this way, the case functioned as both a warning and a lesson. It showed the risks associated with acting on incomplete information, and it highlighted the importance of maintaining procedural integrity even under pressure. It also revealed how difficult it can be to uphold these principles when the stakes are high and the demand for resolution is immediate. Over time, the story of the case began to take on a different tone. It was no longer discussed solely in terms of guilt or innocence, or even in terms of the specific individuals involved. Instead, it was framed as a broader examination of how justice operates within a complex society. The focus shifted from the details of the incident to the implications of those details, from the actions themselves to the structures that allowed those actions to occur. This shift did not resolve the underlying tensions. If anything, it made them more apparent. By placing the case within a larger context, it became clear that the issues it raised were not unique to a single place or time. They were reflective of broader patterns, of recurring challenges that arise whenever systems of authority must navigate the space between evidence and belief, between procedure and outcome. One of the most enduring aspects of the case is the way it challenges the assumption that justice is a fixed concept. It suggests that justice can be interpreted differently depending on perspective, and that these interpretations can lead to actions that conflict with one another. For some, justice is defined by adherence to legal standards, by the requirement that guilt be proven beyond doubt. For others, it is defined by a sense of moral certainty, by the belief that certain actions demand a response regardless of whether they can be legally verified. When these definitions collide, the result can be a breakdown in the very system that is meant to reconcile them. The Massey case illustrates this collision in a stark and unsettling way. The failure of the first trial to produce a verdict created a gap between legal and personal definitions of justice. That gap was then filled by actions that bypassed the system entirely, leading to a second trial that attempted to address those actions within the same framework that had previously been rejected. The commutation of the sentence further complicated the situation, blurring the line between accountability and leniency. In the end, the case does not provide a resolution that satisfies all perspectives. It does not offer a definitive account of what happened on the night of the original accusation, nor does it fully reconcile the actions that followed. Instead, it leaves behind a set of unresolved questions, each tied to a different aspect of the story. What responsibility does a legal system have when it cannot produce a clear verdict in a case that demands one? How should individuals respond when they believe that system has failed them? And what are the consequences when those responses lead to actions that undermine the very principles the system is built upon? These questions remain relevant, not only in the context of the case, but in any situation where justice is contested. They remind us that the pursuit of truth is not always straightforward, and that the methods used to pursue it can have lasting consequences. In reflecting on the case, it becomes clear that its true significance lies not in the events themselves, but in the way those events continue to resonate. It is a story that resists closure, that challenges simple explanations, and that forces us to confront the complexities of justice in a world where certainty is often out of reach. As the years moved further away from 1931 and 1932, the Massey case did not settle into a fixed meaning. Instead, it continued to shift depending on who was telling the story and what they chose to emphasize. It became less about reconstructing a precise sequence of events and more about examining how those events had been understood, interpreted, and remembered. In this way, the case evolved from a legal matter into a lasting narrative about uncertainty, perception, and the fragile nature of justice when it is placed under strain. What makes the case particularly enduring is not simply the fact that it involved violence or controversy, but that it never resolved the central question that initiated everything. The allegation made by Talia Massey remained uncertain. There was no conclusive evidence that could confirm it beyond doubt, yet it also could not be entirely dismissed. This ambiguity created a foundation that was inherently unstable. Every action that followed was built upon it, including the arrests, the trial, the deadlocked jury, and ultimately the decision to act outside the law. Because the foundation itself was uncertain, the structure that rose from it was equally unstable, unable to provide a clear or lasting resolution. Joseph Kahahawai's death stands as the most definitive event in the entire sequence, yet even that clarity does not resolve the larger questions. It provides certainty about what happened in a physical sense, but not about why it happened in a way that satisfies all perspectives. His death was the result of deliberate actions, carried out by individuals who believed they were justified. That belief, however, was rooted in an earlier uncertainty, one that had never been resolved through evidence or legal determination. As a result, his death becomes both a fact and a symbol, representing the consequences of acting on conviction in the absence of certainty. The case also reveals how quickly a narrative can solidify once it aligns with existing social structures. In Honolulu at the time, the division between those who held authority and those who did not was already well established. When the allegation was made, it did not enter a neutral environment. It entered a system in which certain voices were more readily accepted than others. This imbalance influenced the direction of the investigation, the identification of suspects, and the way the case was presented to the public. Even as inconsistencies emerged, the initial narrative retained its influence, shaping how events were interpreted long after the trial had ended. The second trial, which addressed the killing of Kahahawai, might have offered an opportunity to reestablish a sense of balance. The facts of the case were clearer, the sequence of events more defined. Yet, even here, the outcome reflected compromise rather than clarity. The conviction for manslaughter acknowledged that a crime had been committed, but the reduction of the sentence to a single hour of confinement altered the meaning of that acknowledgement. It suggested that the legal system, while capable of identifying wrongdoing, was not fully prepared to impose consequences that matched the severity of the act. This discrepancy between recognition and consequence is one of the most troubling aspects of the case. It highlights the gap that can exist between what is known and how that knowledge is acted upon. In theory, the law provides a framework for addressing wrongdoing in a consistent and impartial manner. In practice, the application of that framework can be influenced by factors that extend beyond the evidence itself. The decision to commute the sentence demonstrated how authority can reshape outcomes, introducing an element of unpredictability into a system that is meant to provide stability. For the community, this unpredictability had lasting effects. It contributed to a sense that justice was not only difficult to achieve, but also difficult to define. Different groups interpreted the same events in fundamentally different ways, and those interpretations were reinforced by the outcomes of the trials. For some, the leniency shown to the defendants confirmed that the system favored those in positions of power. For others, it reflected an understanding of the circumstances that had led to the killing. These perspectives existed simultaneously, each supported by its own logic, each resistant to the other. Over time, the case came to represent more than a single moment of conflict. It became a lens through which broader issues could be examined. It raised questions about the role of evidence in determining truth, about the influence of social structures on legal processes, and about the limits of justice in situations where certainty is unattainable. These questions are not confined to the specific context of Honolulu in the early 20th century. They resonate in any setting where similar tensions exist, where the need for resolution collides with the reality of incomplete information. One of the most significant lessons of the case lies in its demonstration of how fragile the boundary between law and personal action can be. The transition from reliance on the legal system to the decision to act independently did not occur in a vacuum. It was shaped by frustration, by a sense of injustice, and by a belief that the system had failed. Yet that transition carried consequences that extended far beyond the individuals who made the decision. It introduced a form of action that could not be easily contained or justified within the framework of the law, leading to outcomes that the system then had to address after the fact. This sequence creates a paradox. The legal system is designed to prevent individuals from taking justice into their own hands, yet when it fails to produce a clear result, it can inadvertently create conditions in which such actions become more likely. The Massey case illustrates this dynamic in a stark way, showing how the absence of resolution can lead to actions that further complicate the search for truth. At the same time, the case underscores the importance of restraint. It suggests that the integrity of the legal system depends not only on its ability to deliver outcomes, but on its adherence to process, even when that process does not produce the desired result. The decision to bypass that process, regardless of the motivation, introduces a level of uncertainty that can be more damaging than the original ambiguity. In this sense, the case serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice requires patience and discipline, qualities that can be difficult to maintain in the face of strong emotion and public pressure. As the story of the Massey case continues to be told, it remains unresolved in a fundamental way. It does not offer a definitive answer to the question of what happened on the night of the original allegation, nor does it fully reconcile the actions that followed. Instead, it presents a series of events that challenge the idea that truth and justice are always aligned, that they can be clearly identified and consistently applied. The enduring impact of the case lies in this challenge. It forces us to consider the possibility that justice, as it is practiced, may not always reflect the truth, and that the mechanisms designed to uphold it can be influenced by the very factors they are meant to overcome. It asks us to examine the role of belief in shaping action and to recognize the consequences that can arise when belief is allowed to replace evidence. In the end, the Massey case remains a story without a comfortable conclusion. It does not resolve itself neatly, nor does it provide reassurance that the system always works as intended. Instead, it leaves behind a sense of unease, a recognition that even in places defined by beauty and calm, there can exist tensions that, once brought to the surface, reveal the complexities and imperfections of the structures that govern human behavior. As the story continues to echo across time, what remains most striking is not simply what happened, but how easily the boundaries between certainty and assumption were blurred, and how quickly those blurred lines led to irreversible consequences. The Massey case stands as a reminder that events do not exist in isolation. They are shaped by the conditions in which they arise, by the expectations that surround them, and by the decisions made when clarity is absent. It is in this intersection of uncertainty and action that the case finds its most enduring significance. By the time the legal proceedings had concluded and the sentences had been reduced to a symbolic gesture, the immediate structure of the case had effectively collapsed. The courtroom had done its part, issuing a verdict that acknowledged wrongdoing, yet the final outcome suggested that acknowledgement alone was not enough to define justice. Instead, the resolution seemed to exist outside the formal boundaries of the law, influenced by authority in a way that altered its meaning. This dissonance created a lasting tension, one that could not be easily reconciled by referring back to the facts alone. In examining the case from a distance, one is confronted with a series of layered uncertainties. The first lies in the original accusation, a moment that set everything in motion yet remains unresolved in its details. Without definitive evidence, it exists as a possibility rather than a confirmed event, and yet its impact was immediate and profound. It shaped the direction of the investigation, determined who would be suspected, and influenced how those suspicions were perceived by the broader community. The lack of certainty did not diminish its power. Instead, it allowed that power to expand, filling the space where clarity should have been. The second layer of uncertainty emerges in the response to that accusation. The arrests that followed were based on a combination of urgency and assumption, driven by the need to demonstrate that action was being taken. In this process, individuals like Joseph Kahahawai became entangled in a narrative that had already begun to form, one that did not depend solely on evidence, but on the alignment between suspicion and expectation. The trial that followed exposed the weaknesses in that narrative, revealing inconsistencies and gaps that prevented a definitive conclusion. Yet rather than resolving the situation, the deadlocked jury intensified the sense of dissatisfaction, leaving both sides without closure. It is within this unresolved space that the most consequential decision was made. The transition from reliance on the legal system to the act of abduction and killing did not occur because new evidence had emerged or because the truth had been clarified. It occurred because the absence of a clear answer was interpreted as failure. This interpretation transformed uncertainty into justification, allowing belief to take precedence over proof. The decision to act outside the law was framed as a response to injustice, yet it introduced a new injustice, one that could not be undone. The death of Joseph Kahahawai represents the point at which uncertainty was replaced by finality. Unlike the events that preceded it, his death is not subject to doubt. It is a fact, established by the actions of those who took control of his fate. And yet, even this clarity does not resolve the larger questions. It does not confirm his guilt or innocence in relation to the original accusation. It does not validate the actions that led to his death. Instead, It stands as a consequence of a process that failed to distinguish between what was known and what was believed. The second trial attempted to address this consequence within the framework of the law, but its outcome reflected the same tensions that had defined the case from the beginning. The conviction for manslaughter acknowledged that the killing was unlawful, yet it also suggested that the circumstances surrounding it had influenced how it was judged. This duality was further complicated by the decision to reduce the sentence to a single hour of confinement, effectively removing any substantial consequence from the conviction. The result was a resolution that recognized wrongdoing without imposing a penalty that matched its severity. This outcome raises fundamental questions about the nature of accountability. If a crime is acknowledged but not meaningfully punished, what does that acknowledgement represent? Does it serve as a statement of principle, or does it function as a compromise, an attempt to balance competing perspectives without fully satisfying any of them? In the case of the Massey incident, the latter seems more likely. The legal system produced an answer, but that answer was shaped in a way that reflected the broader social dynamics at play, rather than existing independently of them. These dynamics are central to understanding why the case continues to resonate. The division between those who held authority and those who did not influenced every stage of the process, from the initial investigation to the final commutation of the sentence. This influence was not always explicit, but it was consistently present, shaping how events were interpreted and how decisions were made. For those who experienced the system as unequal, the case confirmed their perception that justice was not applied consistently. For those who believed that the system had failed to deliver the correct outcome in the first trial, the actions that followed were seen as an attempt to restore balance, even if that attempt violated the law. The coexistence of these perspectives ensures that the case cannot be reduced to a single narrative. It is not simply a story of crime and punishment, nor is it solely a reflection of social tension. It is both, intertwined in a way that makes it difficult to separate one from the other. The legal aspects of the case cannot be fully understood without considering the social context, and the social context cannot be fully examined without acknowledging the legal outcomes that emerged from it. As time passes, the details of the case may become less immediate, but the questions it raises remain relevant. They extend beyond the specific events of 1931 and 1932, touching on broader issues that continue to shape how justice is understood and applied. How should a system respond when evidence is inconclusive, but the demand for resolution is urgent? What role does belief play in shaping action, particularly when that belief is supported by authority? And how can a society ensure that the pursuit of justice does not lead to actions that undermine the very principles it seeks to uphold? The Massey case does not provide definitive answers to these questions. Instead, it offers a framework for examining them, a set of circumstances that illustrate the complexities involved. It shows that justice is not simply a matter of applying rules, but of navigating the space between certainty and doubt, between procedure and perception. It demonstrates that the consequences of failing to navigate that space carefully can be profound, affecting not only those directly involved, but the broader community as well. In reflecting on the case, one is left with a sense of incompleteness. There is no clear resolution that satisfies all aspects of the story, no single interpretation that can fully encompass its meaning. This incompleteness is not a flaw, but a reflection of the reality it represents. It mirrors the uncertainty that defined the events themselves, the lack of clarity that set everything in motion, and that persisted even after the legal process had run its course. Ultimately, the enduring power of the Massey case lies in its ability to resist closure. It remains open, not in the sense that it is unresolved in a procedural way, but in the sense that its meaning continues to be examined and re-examined. It challenges the assumption that justice can always provide clear answers, and it reminds us that the search for those answers can have consequences that extend far beyond the original question. In the final reflection on the Massey case, what endures is not a sense of resolution, but a lingering awareness of how fragile justice can become when it is placed under pressure from forces it cannot fully control. The events that unfolded in Honolulu during 1931 and 1932 did not follow a simple path from accusation to truth, from investigation to clarity, from trial to closure. Instead, They moved through a series of uncertainties, each one shaping the next, until the distinction between fact and belief became increasingly difficult to maintain. At the center of this unfolding was a single moment that could never be fully verified. The allegation made by Talia Massey created a reality that demanded response, yet that reality was never firmly established through evidence. This absence of certainty did not diminish its impact. It set into motion a process that relied not only on what could be proven, but on what was assumed to be true. In this way, the case demonstrates how powerful an unconfirmed narrative can become when it aligns with existing structures of authority and expectation. The arrests that followed, including that of Joseph Kahahawai, were shaped by this alignment. They reflected a need to act, to show that the system was capable of responding decisively to a serious accusation. Yet in acting quickly, the system also revealed its vulnerability to pressure, its susceptibility to moving forward without the level of certainty that would later prove necessary. The trial exposed these vulnerabilities, bringing to light the inconsistencies and gaps that had been present from the beginning. The inability of the jury to reach a verdict was not simply a procedural outcome. It was an acknowledgement that the truth, as it had been presented, could not be clearly established. This acknowledgement, however, did not resolve the situation. Instead, it created a void, a space in which different interpretations could take hold. For some, the absence of a conviction was seen as a failure of the system, an indication that justice had not been served. For others, it was a reflection of the limitations of the evidence, a reminder that certainty cannot be manufactured when it does not exist. These interpretations coexisted, each supported by its own logic, each resistant to the other. It was within this space of unresolved tension that the most consequential decision was made. The choice to abduct and interrogate Joseph Kahahawai outside the boundaries of the law marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the case. It represented a rejection of the legal process, a move toward a form of action driven by conviction rather than proof. This decision did not arise from new evidence or from a clearer understanding of what had happened. It arose from a belief that the system had failed and that this failure justified a different approach. The consequences of that decision were immediate and irreversible. Kahahawai's death transformed the case, replacing uncertainty with a fact that could not be disputed. Yet even this fact did not provide clarity in the broader sense. It did not answer the questions that had initiated the entire sequence of events. Instead, it introduced a new layer of complexity, one that the legal system would attempt to address in the second trial. That trial offered an opportunity to restore a sense of order, to demonstrate that the system could respond to a clear act of violence in a consistent and meaningful way. The conviction for manslaughter suggested that this restoration was possible, that the law could identify wrongdoing and impose consequences. However, the subsequent commutation of the sentence undermined this possibility. By reducing the punishment to a symbolic hour of confinement, the system introduced a contradiction into its own process. It acknowledged the crime, yet minimized its consequences, creating a disparity that could not be easily reconciled. This disparity is central to the lasting impact of the case. It highlights the tension between recognition and response, between identifying wrongdoing and addressing it in a way that reflects its seriousness. When these elements do not align, the result is a form of justice that appears incomplete, one that satisfies neither the need for accountability nor the demand for fairness. The broader implications of the case extend beyond the specific events that took place. They speak to the challenges inherent in any system that seeks to balance evidence, perception, and authority. The Massey case illustrates how easily this balance can be disrupted and how difficult it can be to restore once it has been lost. It shows that justice is not only a matter of rules and procedures, but of trust, and that this trust can be eroded when outcomes appear inconsistent or influenced by factors outside the evidence. For the community in Honolulu, the case left a lasting imprint. It reinforced existing divisions, highlighting the disparities in how different groups experienced the legal system. For some, it confirmed a sense of marginalization, a belief that justice was not equally accessible or equally applied. For others, It served as a reminder of the limitations of the system, of the possibility that it might fail to deliver outcomes that align with deeply held convictions. These perspectives, shaped by the events of the case, continue to influence how justice was understood and discussed in the years that followed. The unresolved nature of the original allegation remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. It serves as a constant reminder that the entire sequence of events was built upon a foundation that was never fully established. This lack of resolution ensures that the case cannot be neatly categorized or fully understood in a definitive way. It resists closure, maintaining a sense of ambiguity that mirrors the uncertainty at its core. In considering the legacy of the Massey case, it becomes clear that its significance lies not in the answers it provides, but in the questions it raises. It challenges the assumption that justice can always be achieved through established processes, that truth can always be determined through evidence, and that authority can be exercised without consequence. It reveals the complexities that arise when these assumptions are tested and the ways in which those complexities can shape outcomes in unpredictable ways. The case also serves as a reminder of the human element within the system. It shows how individuals, driven by emotion, belief, and a sense of responsibility, can influence the course of events in ways that extend beyond the structures designed to contain them. These influences are not inherently negative, but they become problematic when they override the principles that ensure fairness and consistency. The Massey case illustrates how easily this can occur and how difficult it can be to correct once it has happened. As the story reaches its end, there is no final resolution that brings all elements into alignment. There is no moment in which the truth is fully revealed, or in which justice is clearly and universally recognized. Instead, there is a collection of events, each connected, each contributing to a narrative that remains open to interpretation. This openness is what gives the case its enduring relevance. It invites continued examination, encouraging those who encounter it to consider not only what happened, but how and why it happened in the way that it did. It asks us to reflect on the nature of justice, on the role of evidence and belief, and on the responsibilities that come with the exercise of power. In the end, the Massey case does not provide comfort. It does not reassure us that systems always function as intended or that truth always prevails. Instead, it offers a more complex and less certain perspective, one that acknowledges the limitations of both individuals and institutions. It leaves us with an understanding that justice is not a fixed outcome, but a process, one that requires constant attention, careful judgment, and a willingness to confront the uncertainties that define it. Even after the legal process had run its course and the public attention began to shift elsewhere, the deeper implications of the Massey case continued to unfold in quieter, more persistent ways. The events themselves were finite, confined to a specific period, but the questions they raised proved far more enduring. They settled into the background of public consciousness, resurfacing whenever similar tensions emerged, whenever the balance between law, belief, and authority was called into question. In this way, the case became less of a historical episode and more of a reference point, a moment that could be revisited to understand how systems respond under strain. One of the most significant aspects of the case is how it illustrates the role of perception in shaping reality. From the very beginning, the events were influenced not only by what had happened, but by how those events were understood. The allegation made by Talia Massey did not exist in isolation. It was received within a framework that assigned credibility based on identity and status. This framework influenced the speed and direction of the investigation, guiding attention towards certain individuals while excluding other possibilities. The result was a process that appeared decisive on the surface, but was built on a foundation that had not been fully examined. When the case entered the courtroom, this foundation was tested, and its weaknesses became visible. The inconsistencies in testimony, the lack of physical evidence, and the uncertainty of identification all contributed to a situation in which a definitive conclusion could not be reached. The deadlocked jury reflected this uncertainty, demonstrating that the legal system, when functioning as intended, requires a level of proof that was not present. Yet outside the courtroom, this outcome was interpreted differently. For some, It was not a sign of uncertainty, but of failure, a perception that would shape the actions that followed. This divergence between legal standards and personal belief is central to understanding the escalation that occurred. The legal system operates on the principle that guilt must be established through evidence, that conclusions must be supported by proof. Personal belief, however, does not always adhere to these standards. It can be shaped by emotion, by experience, and by the desire for resolution. When these two approaches come into conflict, the result can be a breakdown in the processes that are meant to maintain order. In the case of Thomas H. Massey, this breakdown manifested as a decision to act outside the law. His actions were driven by a conviction that the system had failed to deliver justice, a belief that transformed uncertainty into justification. This transformation is one of the most critical turning points in the case. It marks the moment when the pursuit of justice shifted from a structured process to an individual decision, one that carried consequences not only for the person targeted, but for the system itself. The killing of Joseph Kahahawai represents the culmination of this shift. It is the point at which belief, untempered by evidence, resulted in an irreversible act. The fact of his death is clear, but the meaning of that death remains contested. It can be seen as the outcome of a system that failed to provide resolution, or as the result of individuals who chose to bypass that system in pursuit of their own conclusions. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive, and it is this overlap that gives the case its complexity. The second trial attempted to address this complexity by focusing on the actions that could be clearly established. The conviction for manslaughter acknowledged that the killing was unlawful, yet it also reflected a degree of mitigation, suggesting that the circumstances surrounding the act influenced how it was judged. The subsequent commutation of the sentence further complicated this judgment, introducing an element of leniency that appeared to contradict the severity of the crime. This contradiction is one of the defining features of the case. It highlights the gap between the identification of wrongdoing and the response to that wrongdoing. In theory, the legal system provides a consistent framework for addressing such situations, ensuring that similar actions result in similar consequences. In practice, however, this consistency can be disrupted by factors that extend beyond the evidence, including social dynamics, public pressure, and the influence of authority. The decision to reduce the sentence to a single hour of confinement exemplifies this disruption. It transformed the outcome of the trial from a statement of accountability into something more symbolic, raising questions about the purpose and effectiveness of the legal process. If a crime can be acknowledged but not meaningfully punished, the value of that acknowledgement becomes uncertain. It suggests that the system is capable of recognizing wrongdoing, but not necessarily of responding to it in a way that reinforces its own principles. For the broader community, this outcome had significant implications. It affected how people understood the relationship between law and power, reinforcing the perception that the application of justice could vary depending on who is involved. This perception did not arise solely from the events of the case, but those events provided a clear and visible example of how such disparities could manifest. The result was a further erosion of trust, particularly among those who already felt marginalized within the system. At the same time, the case also influenced how future situations were approached. It served as a cautionary example of what can happen when the demand for resolution overrides the need for careful examination. The initial response to the allegation, the speed of the arrests, and the subsequent failure to secure a conviction all demonstrated the risks associated with acting on incomplete information. The decision to take justice into one's own hands further illustrated the dangers of allowing belief to replace evidence, showing how such actions can lead to outcomes that complicate rather than resolve the situation. In reflecting on these developments, it becomes clear that the Massey case is not simply about what happened, but about how those events were interpreted and acted upon. It reveals the importance of maintaining a distinction between perception and proof, and the consequences that can arise when that distinction is blurred. It also highlights the role of the legal system in mediating this distinction, providing a structured process for evaluating claims and determining outcomes. However, the case also demonstrates the limitations of this process. When evidence is inconclusive, the system may be unable to provide the clarity that people seek. In such situations, The absence of resolution can be as challenging as an unfavorable outcome, creating a sense of dissatisfaction that can lead to further action. The challenge, then, is not only to ensure that the system functions correctly, but to manage the expectations that surround it, to recognize that not all cases will produce definitive answers. The enduring relevance of the Massey case lies in its ability to illustrate these challenges in a concrete and compelling way. It shows how the pursuit of justice can be influenced by factors that extend beyond the evidence, and how those influences can shape both the process and the outcome. It also demonstrates the importance of restraint, of adhering to principles even when they do not produce the desired result. As the case continues to be examined, it serves as a reminder that justice is not a simple concept, nor is it easily achieved. It requires a balance between competing factors, a commitment to fairness, and an understanding of the limitations inherent in any system. The Massey case does not provide a model for how justice should be administered, but it does offer insight into what can happen when that administration is disrupted. In the end, the case leaves us with a set of questions that remain as relevant today as they were at the time of the events. How should a society respond when evidence is insufficient to produce a clear verdict? What responsibilities do individuals have in respecting the processes designed to address such situations? And how can a system maintain its integrity when faced with pressure from those who believe it has failed? These questions do not have easy answers, and the Massey case does not attempt to provide them. Instead, it presents a narrative that invites reflection, encouraging us to consider the complexities of justice and the ways in which it can be both upheld and undermined. As the story reaches its final stage, what remains is not a conclusion in the traditional sense, but a quiet, persistent tension that refuses to settle. The Massey case does not end with a clear resolution or a moment of closure. Instead, it lingers in the space between what is known and what can never be fully proven, leaving behind a narrative that continues to challenge the way justice is understood. It is a story that resists being simplified, one that demands to be examined not for the answers it provides, but for the uncertainties it exposes. At its core, the case is defined by a sequence of decisions made in the absence of certainty. The initial allegation introduced a possibility that could not be confirmed, yet it was treated as a reality that required immediate action. This decision to act, rather than to wait for clarity, set the tone for everything that followed. It established a pattern in which urgency took precedence over verification, and in doing so, it created a chain of events that would become increasingly difficult to control. The arrests that followed were part of this chain, shaped by the need to respond rather than the ability to prove. The individuals who were taken into custody became part of a narrative that had already begun to form, one that was influenced as much by expectation as by evidence. When the case reached the courtroom, this narrative was tested and found to be incomplete. The inability of the jury to reach a verdict did not resolve the situation, but instead deepened the sense of uncertainty, leaving behind a question that had no clear answer. It was in this unresolved space that the most consequential actions took place. The decision to abduct Joseph Kahahawai and attempt to force a confession represented a departure from the principles that had guided the legal process up to that point. It was a moment in which belief was allowed to override procedure, in which the desire for resolution led to actions that could not be justified within the framework of the law. This decision transformed the case, shifting it from a question of what had happened to a demonstration of what can occur when the boundaries of justice are crossed. Kahahawai's death is the most definitive element of the entire narrative, yet it does not bring clarity to the questions that preceded it. Instead, it introduces a new form of certainty, one that exists alongside the original uncertainty, without resolving it. His death is a fact, established beyond doubt, but its meaning is shaped by the context in which it occurred. It can be seen as the result of a system that failed to provide resolution, or as the consequence of individuals who chose to act outside that system. These interpretations are not easily reconciled, and their coexistence ensures that the case remains open to debate. The second trial attempted to impose structure on this complexity, focusing on the actions that could be clearly established. The conviction for manslaughter acknowledged that a crime had been committed, yet it also suggested that the circumstances surrounding the case had influenced how that crime was understood. This duality was further complicated by the decision to reduce the sentence to a single hour of confinement, an act that transformed the outcome of the trial into something that appeared symbolic rather than substantive. This transformation raises fundamental questions about the nature of justice. If a crime is recognized but not meaningfully punished, what does that recognition represent? Does it serve as a reaffirmation of the principles of the legal system, or does it undermine those principles by demonstrating that they can be altered? In the case of the Massey incident, the answer is not clear. The legal system functioned in the sense that it identified wrongdoing and issued a verdict, but the final outcome suggests that its authority was not absolute, that it could be reshaped by decisions made outside its immediate framework. The impact of this outcome extended beyond the individuals directly involved. It influenced how the broader community understood the relationship between law and power, reinforcing the perception that justice could be uneven in its application. For those who already felt excluded from the system, the case provided a clear example of how outcomes could differ depending on who was involved. This perception did not arise in isolation, but was shaped by the broader social context in which the events took place, a context marked by divisions that the case both reflected and intensified. At the same time, the case also serves as a reminder of the limitations of any system that relies on human judgment. The legal process is designed to evaluate evidence and reach conclusions based on that evidence, but it cannot eliminate uncertainty entirely. When evidence is inconclusive, the system must acknowledge that limitation, even if it leads to outcomes that are unsatisfying. The challenge lies in accepting these limitations without allowing them to justify actions that undermine the system itself. The Massey case illustrates what can happen when this balance is not maintained. The transition from legal process to personal action, from uncertainty to conviction, resulted in consequences that extended far beyond the original allegation. It demonstrated how quickly the pursuit of justice can become distorted when it is driven by belief rather than evidence, and how difficult it can be to restore order once that distortion has occurred. As the story draws to a close, it becomes clear that its significance lies not in the events themselves, but in the questions they raise. It challenges the assumption that justice is always attainable, that truth can always be established, and that systems designed to uphold fairness can operate independently of the contexts in which they exist. It reveals the complexities that arise when these assumptions are tested and the ways in which those complexities can shape both actions and outcomes. The absence of a definitive resolution is not a weakness of the story, but a reflection of the reality it represents. It mirrors the uncertainty that defined the events from the beginning, the lack of clarity that set everything in motion and that persisted even as the legal process attempted to impose order. This uncertainty is what gives the case its enduring power, ensuring that it remains relevant long after the events themselves have passed. In the end, the Massey case leaves us with a sense of unease, a recognition that justice is not always clear or consistent, and that the pursuit of it can lead to outcomes that are difficult to reconcile. It asks us to consider the role of evidence and belief, the influence of power and perception, and the responsibilities that come with the authority to act. It reminds us that the line between right and wrong is not always as distinct as it appears, and that crossing that line, even with the intention of seeking justice, can have consequences that cannot be undone. What remains, then, is not a conclusion, but an invitation to reflect, to look beyond the surface of events and consider the deeper forces that shape them, to recognize the limitations of systems and the importance of maintaining their integrity, and to understand that in the absence of certainty, the choices we make carry a weight that extends far beyond the moment in which they are made. In the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened, when the intensity of the trials had faded and the headlines no longer dominated public attention, the Massey case settled into something more enduring than a verdict or a historical record. It became a kind of echo, repeating itself in the ways people spoke about justice, in the hesitations that surfaced when trust in the system was questioned, and in the unspoken understanding that not every story reaches a clean or satisfying end. It is in this lingering presence that the true weight of the case can be felt, not as a moment frozen in time, but as a continuing influence on how events are perceived long after they have passed. What remains most unsettling is how easily the sequence began. A single allegation, uncertain and unverified, was enough to trigger a chain of reactions that no one could fully control. This is not unusual in itself, as systems are designed to respond to claims of harm. What distinguishes this case is the speed with which the response moved forward and the degree to which that movement was shaped by factors beyond evidence. The need to act, to demonstrate that something was being done, created a momentum that carried the case forward even as the foundation beneath it remained unstable. That instability was exposed during the first trial, when the evidence failed to produce a clear conclusion. The deadlocked jury was not simply an outcome, but a reflection of the limitations inherent in the case. It showed that certainty could not be forced, that the absence of proof could not be resolved through deliberation alone. Yet outside the courtroom, this outcome did not function as a point of acceptance. Instead, it became a source of frustration, a gap that demanded to be filled. It is within this gap that the most critical transformation occurred. The decision to move beyond the legal system, to take control of the situation through direct action, represents a turning point that defines the entire narrative. It is the moment when belief overtakes procedure, when the desire for resolution becomes more powerful than the requirement for proof. This shift is not unique to this case, but here it is laid bare, its consequences visible in a way that cannot be ignored. The abduction and killing of Joseph Kahahawai are the direct result of this shift. They represent the point at which uncertainty is replaced by action, where the lack of clarity is no longer tolerated and is instead addressed through force. This act introduces a form of certainty that is absolute in its physical reality, yet incomplete in its meaning. Kahahawai's death is undeniable, but it does not answer the question of his involvement in the original allegation. It does not confirm guilt or innocence. Instead, it exists as a consequence of a process that failed to distinguish between what was known and what was assumed. The second trial attempts to impose order on this outcome, to bring the actions back within the framework of the law. The conviction for manslaughter suggests that this is possible, that the system can recognize wrongdoing and respond accordingly. However, the reduction of a sentence to a single hour of confinement disrupts this effort, transforming what could have been a reaffirmation of legal principles into something far more ambiguous. It introduces the idea that even when the system functions, its outcomes can be altered in ways that undermine their significance. This ambiguity is central to the lasting impact of the case. It prevents a clear understanding from taking hold, ensuring that the events remain open to interpretation. For some, the outcome represents a failure of justice, a demonstration that the system is unable to hold individuals accountable when power is involved. For others, it reflects a recognition of the complexity of the situation, an acknowledgement that the actions taken cannot be fully understood without considering the context in which they occurred. These perspectives coexist, each reinforcing the other's uncertainty, each contributing to the ongoing debate. As the case moves further into the past, it becomes less about the individuals involved and more about the structures that shape their actions. It highlights the influence of social divisions, the ways in which authority and credibility are distributed, and the impact these factors have on the pursuit of justice. It shows how narratives can form and solidify, guiding the interpretation of events even in the absence of definitive proof. And it reveals how difficult it can be to challenge those narratives once they have taken hold. At the same time, the case also serves as a reminder of the human element within these structures. The decisions that were made were not abstract or inevitable. They were the result of choices, influenced by emotion, belief, and the desire for resolution. These choices carried consequences, not only for those directly involved, but for the broader community. They demonstrate how individual actions can intersect with systemic forces, creating outcomes that reflect both personal and collective dynamics. One of the most enduring questions raised by the case is whether justice can truly function in the absence of certainty. The legal system is designed to operate within defined parameters, requiring evidence and adherence to procedure. Yet when those parameters fail to produce a clear result, the system is left in a difficult position. It must either accept the ambiguity or attempt to resolve it through other means. The Massey case shows what can happen when that ambiguity is not accepted, when the need for resolution leads to actions that exist outside the law. This tension between acceptance and action is at the heart of the case's lasting relevance. It speaks to a broader challenge that extends beyond any single event, touching on the fundamental question of how societies respond to uncertainty. Do they uphold the principles that guide their systems, even when those principles lead to unsatisfying outcomes? Or do they seek alternative paths that promise resolution but risk undermining the very structures they depend on? The Massey case does not provide a definitive answer to this question. Instead, it illustrates the consequences of one particular path, showing how the pursuit of certainty through action can lead to outcomes that complicate rather than resolve the original problem. It reveals the importance of restraint, of recognizing the limits of what can be known, and of respecting the processes designed to navigate those limits. In its final form, the case remains a narrative defined by absence as much as by presence. The absence of conclusive evidence in the original allegation, the absence of a clear verdict in the first trial, the absence of meaningful punishment in the second, all contribute to a story that is incomplete in a way that feels intentional rather than accidental. This incompleteness is what gives the case its enduring power, ensuring that it continues to be examined and re-examined from different perspectives. There is no single lesson that can be drawn from the Massey case, no straightforward conclusion that can be applied universally. Instead, it offers a series of reflections, each one highlighting a different aspect of the complexities involved. It shows that justice is not a static concept, but a dynamic process shaped by the interplay of evidence, perception, and authority. It reminds us that this process is vulnerable to disruption, and that maintaining its integrity requires a commitment to principles that may not always produce immediate or satisfying results. As the story finally settles into silence, what remains is not a sense of closure, but a recognition of the questions that continue to linger. They do not demand answers, but they invite consideration, encouraging a deeper understanding of the challenges inherent in the pursuit of justice. And in that invitation, the case finds its lasting significance, not as a resolved event, but as an ongoing reflection on the nature of truth, belief, and the consequences of acting when certainty is out of reach.